Let me begin with something that most people don't want to hear. The person you have been praying for, hoping for, or imagining may not be somewhere far away. They may already be closer than you think. And the reason you haven't recognized them may have less to do with their absence and more to do with what your mind has been trained to look for. We tend to believe that important people must enter our lives dramatically. We imagine a perfect meeting, an unforgettable first conversation, some extraordinary moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. But life rarely works that way. The most significant relationships often begin quietly. They begin as ordinary conversations, familiar faces, simple interactions, or people we barely notice because they don't fit the story we have already written in our minds. Think about how powerful that is. Your expectations can become a filter. Psychologically, we don't simply see reality, we interpret it through our beliefs, experiences, fears, and desires. If you've convinced yourself that your soulmate must look a certain way, live somewhere else, have a particular personality, or arrive under extraordinary circumstances, you may completely overlook someone who doesn't match the picture. And this is where many people make a profound mistake. They search for a feeling instead of observing a character. They ask, "Do I feel butterflies?" But a better question is, who is this person when nobody is watching? They ask, "Do they make my heart race?" But perhaps the deeper question is, do they make me more honest, more peaceful, more courageous, and more capable of becoming the person I am meant to be? Because intensity is not always intimacy, chemistry is not always compatibility, and excitement is not always evidence of destiny. Sometimes the person nearest to you has been overlooked because familiarity has made them invisible. You see them repeatedly, so your mind categorizes them as ordinary. And once the brain categorizes something as familiar, it stops giving it the same level of attention. You no longer examine it. You simply assume you already know what it is. But people change, circumstances change, and sometimes your perception changes before the person ever does. Someone you once saw as just a friend may eventually reveal a depth you never noticed. Someone you've known through work or your community may suddenly become significant when circumstances create a different kind of conversation. Someone you previously dismissed may demonstrate loyalty, wisdom, patience, or emotional strength that you were too distracted to recognize. That doesn't mean you should force every familiar relationship into the idea of a soulmate. It means you should become more attentive to reality and less attached to fantasy. There is a philosophical lesson here. What we expect to find often determines what we are capable of recognizing. If you are constantly looking for something extraordinary, you may miss the extraordinary hidden inside the ordinary. And perhaps that is why the title of this message matters so much. Your soulmate may be nearer than ever, but their place may shock you. Not because some mysterious person is guaranteed to appear tomorrow, but because the truth about meaningful connection is often far less theatrical than we imagine. The deeper question isn't simply, where is the person meant for me? The deeper question is, have I developed the awareness to recognize a healthy, meaningful connection when it stands in front of me? Or, because finding someone is only half the journey, recognizing their value is another, and being prepared to build something lasting with them is another entirely. So today, stop looking only toward the horizon. Look around you. Pay attention to the people already crossing your path. Notice character, notice consistency, notice how someone treats people who cannot benefit them. Notice whether their presence produces growth rather than confusion. You don't need to turn every interaction into a prophecy. You simply need to become awake to the possibilities you have been too distracted to see. Because sometimes the greatest surprise isn't discovering that someone new has entered your life. It's discovering that someone important was already there, and you finally became ready to see them. And once you understand that, you begin to see something even deeper. Sometimes what you call a hidden connection isn't hidden because the person is deliberately being kept from you. It's hidden because your expectations are standing between you and reality. We have a remarkable tendency as human beings to search for extraordinary signs while overlooking ordinary circumstances. We want the dramatic entrance, the perfect timing, the unmistakable feeling, the moment that seems almost scripted. We think that if something is truly meant for us, it must arrive with fireworks. But real life rarely announces its most important moments that way. Sometimes the person who changes your life enters through a completely ordinary door. They may be someone you encounter in a familiar environment, someone connected to your daily routine, someone you have spoken to many times without realizing that one day that conversation would mean something different. And this is where the human mind can deceive us. We tend to associate significance with novelty. If something is new, we pay attention. If something is familiar, we assume we already understand it. But familiarity does not mean insignificance. Think about the people you have encountered repeatedly. How many of them have you judged within seconds? How many have you placed into categories, friend, co-worker, neighbor, acquaintance, stranger, and then stopped asking questions? The mind loves categories because categories make life easier. They reduce complexity, but they can also blind us. You may have already decided who someone is based on a single interaction, an old impression, or an assumption that was never tested. Meanwhile, that person may have matured, changed, developed greater emotional depth, or revealed qualities you were simply not paying attention to. This is why awareness matters. If you believe that the right person must arrive in a specific form, you create a psychological boundary around possibility. You don't recognize what doesn't fit the picture. And when reality refuses to match your expectations, you conclude that nothing is happening. But perhaps something is happening. Perhaps you're simply looking for it in the wrong place. And let's take this one step further. Sometimes the reason a connection appears ordinary is because you are not supposed to recognize its significance immediately. Not every meaningful relationship begins with certainty. Some begin with curiosity. Some begin with friendship. Some begin with a simple conversation that seems insignificant at the time. You don't always know the meaning of a moment while you're living it. That's one of the strange truths about life. We often understand significance backward. We look back months or years later and realize that conversation mattered, that person mattered, that decision changed everything. At the time, it felt ordinary. And perhaps that's the lesson you need to hear today. Stop demanding that life prove everything to you immediately. If you are constantly searching for signs, you may become so obsessed with interpretation that you stop observing reality. You'll turn every glance into a message, every coincidence into a prediction, and every emotional reaction into proof. That's not discernment. That's projection. True discernment is quieter. It watches, it listens, it notices patterns, it examines character. It gives time the opportunity to reveal what emotion cannot. So if there is someone already near you who seems ordinary, don't immediately assume they are destined to become your partner, but don't dismiss them simply because they don't match your fantasy either. Ask better questions. How do they treat people when they have nothing to gain? How do they respond under pressure? Do they respect boundaries? Are they consistent? Can they communicate honestly? Do you feel psychologically safe around them? Does knowing them encourage you to become healthier, wiser, and more authentic? Those questions will tell you far more than temporary excitement ever could. Because the person meant to play a meaningful role in your life may not arrive looking like an answer. They may simply arrive looking like a person. And your responsibility is not to force the story. Your responsibility is to become awake enough to recognize what is real. Sometimes the greatest revelation is not that someone suddenly appeared in your life. It is that your eyes finally opened to someone who had been there all along. And this brings us to another uncomfortable truth. The person who is right for you may not look like the person you imagined. This is where we have to challenge one of the most powerful forces shaping our relationships, our internal picture of what love is supposed to look like. Most people don't realize how much of their romantic expectations were constructed long before they actually understood relationships. Movies, culture, past experiences, family patterns, social media, and personal fantasies quietly create an image in our minds. Then we meet real people and compare them against an imaginary standard. And when reality doesn't match the picture, we often reject reality. We say, They're not my type. But what exactly does that mean? Sometimes my type simply means familiar. Sometimes it means emotionally predictable. Sometimes it means someone who activates an old pattern we've mistaken for attraction. And sometimes it means a collection of superficial qualities that have very little connection to whether two people can actually build a meaningful life together. You can be attracted to someone's appearance and still be incompatible with their character. You can feel an intense connection with someone and still be unable to create stability together. And you can meet someone who doesn't immediately fit your expectations, only to discover that their character possesses everything you actually need. This is why maturity changes the way you understand attraction. When you're younger or simply less aware, you may ask, "Who gives me the strongest feeling?" But as you grow, the question becomes, "Who brings out the strongest version of me?" That's a completely different question, because a healthy relationship isn't supposed to merely entertain your emotions. It should challenge your character, deepen your understanding, and create an environment where both people can become more fully themselves. Imagine meeting someone who doesn't create constant uncertainty, someone who communicates instead of manipulating, someone who respects your boundaries instead of testing them, someone whose presence brings clarity instead of confusion. At first, that kind of relationship might even feel unfamiliar. Why? Because if you've become accustomed to emotional chaos, peace can feel boring. If you've become accustomed to chasing someone, consistency can feel strange. If you've spent years proving your worth, someone who naturally respects you may feel almost suspicious. That's why personal growth matters so much in recognizing the right connection. You cannot always recognize what is healthy when your mind has been trained to desire what is familiar. And this is where the soulmate idea becomes much more meaningful. Forget the fantasy that there is one flawless human being somewhere in the world who possesses every quality you've imagined. Human beings are not perfect formulas. Relationships are not magical equations. The deeper possibility is that you may encounter someone with whom your values, character, direction, and willingness to grow align in a remarkable way. That's much more powerful than perfection, because the right person isn't necessarily someone who completes you as though you were half a human being without them. The right person can be someone who joins you as a whole person and chooses to build something meaningful alongside you. That's the difference between dependency and partnership. And sometimes the person who shocks you is the person who doesn't fit the old version of you. Maybe they aren't the appearance you expected. Maybe they don't have the personality you once chased. Maybe they don't create the emotional turbulence you once confused with passion. Maybe they simply bring something much rarer: peace, honesty, respect, consistency, and a shared desire to grow. At first, you might wonder, why doesn't this feel like everything I've experienced before? And perhaps the answer is exactly that. It doesn't feel like your past because it isn't supposed to reproduce your past. Your future doesn't need to resemble the relationships that wounded you, so don't judge a person solely by whether they match your old definition of attraction. Look deeper. Look at character. Look at emotional maturity. Look at values. Look at how they handle responsibility. Look at how they treat you when they're frustrated. Look at whether their actions remain consistent when the excitement fades. Because eventually, beauty becomes familiar. Excitement becomes normal. But character reveals whether something can last. And perhaps the person who surprises you most will not be the person who matches the fantasy you created years ago. They may be the person who finally shows you why you needed to outgrow that fantasy in the first place. Sometimes love doesn't arrive looking like what you asked for. Sometimes it arrives looking like what you actually needed. And now we come to the part that can genuinely challenge your assumptions. The greatest surprise may not be who this person is, but where they come from. Because most of us imagine that the person who changes our life must come from somewhere outside our existing world. We imagine a stranger appearing at exactly the right moment, someone completely disconnected from our past, our routines, and our familiar environment. We think the newness itself is evidence of significance. But sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the person who becomes important is already connected to your world in a way you never considered. They may be someone you've known casually, someone you've worked alongside, someone you've spoken to occasionally, someone you've seen so many times that your brain stopped registering their presence as remarkable. And that's the psychological paradox of familiarity. What we see repeatedly can become almost invisible. Your mind is designed to conserve attention. If something appears predictable, your brain doesn't need to spend much energy analyzing it. That's useful for survival, but it can become a problem when applied to human beings. You may think you know someone simply because you've known of them for a long time. But knowing someone's name is not knowing their character. Seeing someone regularly is not understanding their heart, and remembering someone's past does not necessarily tell you who they are becoming. People evolve, you evolve, circumstances evolve. And sometimes a relationship changes, not because one person suddenly became someone else, but because you finally became capable of seeing them differently. Think about how often your perception of someone changes after one meaningful conversation. Suddenly, the person you thought you understood becomes more complex. You discover their fears, ambitions, values, struggles, humor, intelligence, or emotional depth, and you realize that the version of them you carried in your mind was incomplete. This is why we have to be careful with labels. Just a friend. Just a coworker. Just someone I know. Or just an acquaintance. Those words can become psychological walls. They tell your brain, I already know what this person is. But you don't, not completely. And I'm not saying that every familiar person is secretly your future partner. That's fantasy, not wisdom. The point is much more practical. Don't confuse familiarity with insignificance. Give reality the opportunity to surprise you. Sometimes the person you overlooked becomes significant because circumstances reveal qualities you couldn't see before. Maybe you see how they respond during difficulty. Maybe you observe their loyalty when there is nothing to gain. Maybe you hear them speak about their future and realize that their values are remarkably aligned with yours. And suddenly the question changes. You aren't asking, why didn't I notice them before? You're asking, what else have I been overlooking? That's a powerful question because it expands your awareness beyond romance. Maybe you've been overlooking opportunities because they weren't packaged the way you expected. Maybe you've been overlooking people because they weren't trying to impress you. Maybe you've been overlooking possibilities because they arrived quietly instead of dramatically. We live in a culture that rewards spectacle. Everything is designed to capture attention. Bigger, faster, louder, more dramatic. But meaningful things don't always work that way. Trust grows quietly. Character reveals itself slowly. Love matures gradually. And some of the most important relationships in your life may begin without any cinematic moment at all. That is why patience is not passivity. Patience is the willingness to let reality reveal itself without forcing it into your preferred narrative. Don't manufacture a soulmate out of loneliness. Don't turn coincidence into certainty. Don't force a relationship simply because you want the story to be true. Instead, observe, listen, pay attention. Let consistency speak louder than promises. Let characters speak louder than chemistry. Let time reveal what excitement cannot. Because if someone is genuinely capable of becoming important in your life, you won't need to invent their significance. Their actions will gradually reveal it. And perhaps that's where the shock lies. You may spend years looking for someone extraordinary, only to discover that extraordinary character was standing in an ordinary place. The surprise isn't always that someone new arrived. Sometimes the surprise is realizing that what mattered was never as far away as you believed.